Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something super fascinating, the philosophy of evidence, belief, and how human logic actually works. We're going to explore a really incredible puzzle about the weight of evidence and exactly how we evaluate truth. I want you to picture balancing the scales of justice in your mind. Imagine, on one side, you've got centuries of rigorous proof, massive historical consensus, and literally monumental effort. But on the other side? Just a tiny, fleeting, completely baseless doubt. How does our mind even process that kind of imbalance? Well, today we're breaking down the logic of faith using this brilliantly evocative metaphor from our source text. It's an awesome journey into how we weigh monumental truths against, just passing skepticism. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The Giant Door and the Fly's Wing. Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp the underlying philosophy and the profound message here, we need to do a little bit of a dramatic thought experiment. Picture a massive, impossibly heavy, giant door. Think of towering, solid iron gates. Now imagine that to push this immense door open, thousands upon thousands of people have been working tirelessly together for centuries. They've poured in immense physical effort, countless proofs, and profound collective wisdom to slowly creak those heavy hinges open. Now, what if someone just walked up to that fully open door, just one single isolated person, and claimed they could slam that colossal thing shut using nothing but a tiny, completely baseless doubt? Would that make any logical sense to you? No, absolutely not. No way. And this scenario establishes the core theme of our explainer today, the staggering metaphor of disproportion. We are presented with a pretty stark contrast here. On the one hand, you've got the undeniable weight of history, thousands of people, centuries of relentless effort, and countless undeniable proofs, all pushing in the exact same direction. It's basically a towering monument of verified evidence. And up against all that, one person. A tiny, baseless doubt. Just a mere whisper of a question with absolutely zero foundation to stand on. Our source text uses this striking comparison to ask a really fundamental question about how we evaluate reality. When you weigh the massive collective historical effort of truth seekers against an isolated, unfounded skepticism, well, the utter absurdity of that isolated doubt overpowering the collective effort becomes glaringly obvious, doesn't it? Moving on to Section 2, the weight of unshakable evidence. So the crucial point is how this brings us to a highly specific theological framework detailed in our source text, a concept they call the 12th Truth. This 12th truth takes that exact thought experiment of the giant door we just talked about and applies it directly to the concepts of faith, the afterlife, and spiritual certainty. According to this specific framework, the path to these spiritual realities hasn't just been casually suggested. The text argues it's been forced open by an overwhelming weight of evidence, and the author categorizes this into three interconnected pillars. First up, all the prophets throughout human history whose messages, the text states, were uniquely supported by observable physical miracles. Second, the saints and spiritual guides whose personal paths were confirmed by deep internal visions and wonders. And third, the profound scholars who testify to these truths through rigorous logical and intellectual research. The author essentially posits that empirical, spiritual, and intellectual proof all stack together, right? They represent this unified, monumental force that has actually opened the path to the afterlife and the gates of heaven. The source text is basically challenging us to view this as a massive historical consensus. Section 3. Logical disproportion. Now let's see how this builds into a deeper discussion of what we're calling logical disproportion. If we accept the text's premise that there's this absolute mountain of evidence, prophets, saints, and scholars all pointing in the exact same direction over millennia, how should we logically treat the counter-arguments? Well, the text argues that the arguments against this massive consensus are incredibly minor in comparison. Just consider this remarkably powerful excerpt from the source text. It asks, can weak delusions without even the strength of a fly's wing close the path to the afterlife and the gates of heaven? Just picture that contrast for a second. On one side, you have the heavy, towering, majestic gates of heaven, swung open by centuries of what the text describes as miraculous, visionary, and scholarly proof. On the flip side, you have a delusion so incredibly weak, so fragile, that the author compares it to something that doesn't even have the strength of a fly's wing. It's an evocative image, and the author uses it to highlight what they argue is the utter ridiculousness of letting a flimsy, passing doubt override a profoundly established truth. And this brilliantly illustrates the core synthesis of the whole argument. You're basically weighing consistent testimony, meaning thousands of independent sources from entirely different eras, different cultural backgrounds, and different intellectual disciplines, all arriving independently at the exact same conclusion. You're weighing all of that against an isolated person offering a temporary baseless doubt. When you map it out logically, it becomes a pure question of mathematical weight.
I mean, to try and invalidate the consistent, cross-verified testimony of thousands of independent sources with the fleeting, transient doubt of just a single, isolated individual, that isn't just everyday skepticism. According to the framework in our source material, it's actually a massive structural logical fallacy.
Which brings us to Section 4, the challenge of the Quran. To really cap off this rigorous argument about the scales of justice and the immense weight of verified evidence, the source material introduces a definitive historical challenge. It anchors the entire philosophical proposition into one foundational text, citing a very specific and famous verse, Surah Al-Isra, chapter 17, verse 88. It reads, "Say, if mankind and the jinn," which, by the way, are unseen spiritual beings in Islamic theology, gathered in order to produce the like of this Quran, they could not produce the like of it, even if they were to each other assistants. Now, for the worldview presented in the source, this acts as the absolute definitive anchor for everything we've just discussed. The text presents this as a proof so heavy, so monumental, and so uniquely constructed that even if every single conscious being collaborated to try and replicate it, they'd fail completely. Because of this, the argument posits that attempting to dismiss this towering edifice of truth with a mere fly's wing of doubt is, logically speaking, impossible. So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to turn this fascinating logic right back over to you. Think about it. Have you ever experienced a moment where a single person's doubt entirely failed to convince you against something that had already been verified by numerous independent sources? Maybe you've experienced this in your career, perhaps regarding a really well-established scientific consensus. Or maybe even just a deep, verified personal truth in your own life. Whenever you're faced with sudden skepticism, I highly encourage you to remember this framework. Always take a step back. Objectively weigh the centuries of evidence, the thousands of voices, and the giant open doors against those flimsy passing delusions that, honestly, quite often lack the strength of a fly's wing. It's an incredibly powerful mental model for navigating truth in absolutely any aspect of life. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating logic, and keep carefully weighing your evidence.